Good morning, everybody. My name is Lily Benowitz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a program manager at Environmental Initiative. We're so glad that all of you could join us today for our first ever virtual policy forum. We're very excited to try some new things. That all of you can join us in what I've been calling our little experiment, and we can't wait to dive into our content. Before we get started, we wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that we're convening this space from Minnesota, the homeland of the Dakota people, where Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples, as well as other indigenous peoples from various tribes currently reside. Indigenous people are here and they're still thriving. This acknowledgement calls us to learn about the histories of the lands that we convene on and seek to understand and include Indigenous perspectives in our work, especially as we build towards a healthy environment and equitable society. We ask that to start the day that everyone says hello in the chat with who you are and where you're calling from, including the native land you're on. If you don't know what native land you're on, we will drop a link in the chat where you can look that up so that we can all know where we're dialing in from. So I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes to say hello in the chat so we know who's here. So keep welcoming each other in the chat. For those of you who don't know, Environmental Initiative strives to catalyze collaboration across perspectives, power, and systems for social equity and environmental health. We are committed to centering equity in our work, and because we understand that the environmental challenges we face today are inextricably linked with economic vitality and social equity, and we cannot address one without the other. And here is our new theory of change from our strategic planning process that we just concluded, I think, last week. So y'all are the first group to see our new theory of change, mission, vision, and how we make impact in the world. I would also like to thank the people who made this policy forum possible, and we believe that the most generative ideas come through collaboration, and we want to give a shout out to all the people who helped inform this forum. We create these events through talking with our partners, talking with experts in the field to really hone what is the most interesting kind of intersection of ideas to cover in a particular environmental policy forum. And so want to give a shout out to both our planning group members as well as our speakers who helped inform this event. Additionally, we want to thank our sponsors for this series. Our presenting series sponsors are Dorsey and Whitney and Wank. Joining us from Dorsey this morning is Brian Bell, and joining us from Wank is Katie Swore. We also would not be able to have such a dynamic event without our wonderful speakers. Thank you all for being here today and for taking the time before our event to record some interviews with us. If you haven't had a chance to listen to our pre-recorded interviews, we'll be sending those out after the event as well, and they were included in the confirmation email for this event to get a deeper dive into the perspectives of each of our speakers this morning. A couple more notes of just orienting you to our Zoom room. So we'll be starting today with hearing from our speakers that will build upon their pre-interviews. You'll also have an opportunity to ask the speakers questions in the chat. Because we have a smaller group today, you'll have the option to ask the speakers questions directly. And then we're gonna break out into some self-guided breakout rooms to really explore how the topics that we are covering today apply to your work specifically, and also give you an opportunity to interact with other participants today. Following this morning's webinar, we're also going to be sending out a summary audio piece with high-level topics from today's discussion, as well as we would love to hear your voices and what you thought and your takeaways from this session. And so there'll be more information at the end about how you can get your voice heard in one of those audio pieces. And finally, a couple more things about being in Zoom. We invite you to hover over your name in the participants list and update your name to include your organization, name, and pronouns so we know who you are. We also ask that you keep your audio muted when you're not sharing and turn on your video when you feel comfortable. We'll also be alternating between slides and being in gallery view to maximize all of your flexibility and how you want to experience Zoom today. And you can follow along on social media. On Twitter, we are at ENV Initiative, and you can tweet with the hashtag PolicyForumEI, and those will all be in the bottom corner of the slides as well. So that was a lot of information, or at least I felt like it was a lot of information sitting at my dining room table. And I'm so excited to pass the mic over to my colleague Malia, who's going to introduce our speakers and facilitate our panel discussion. And just so everyone knows, we're going to stay in gallery view for the panel position, so that if you want, you can switch your screen over into speaker view or into gallery view, just in terms of making sure that you're having the experience that you'd like. So Malia, I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks, Lily. And I'm just going to say a couple of words about our topic this morning, which doesn't need too much of an introduction. And then we'll get into our panel. But I wanted to start by saying thanks for joining us today. And just note that in general, we really try to focus these forums on really timely topics. So usually that's something that relates to environmental decisions that we're making as a state in real time. It's a policy that's being discussed, or something new that's being implemented, or funding that's being distributed. So it's probably no surprise that we, when we surveyed recent forum attendees back in May, people really universally indicated that they wanted to hear about the impacts of changes in the economy on the environment and decision making. That's pretty typical, I think, for a lot of our audience. So the topic of economic recovery seemed like a really obvious and relevant place to begin, and that was in mid-May. And then we were faced by the sudden and deep recession. And then George Floyd was killed less than a mile and a half from the spot that I'm now sitting. So as Justin Ellis recently wrote in The Atlantic, my hometown of Minneapolis faces a reckoning, not a rebuilding. So we know, and frankly, we really have long known, and simply just can no longer ignore that we must, across all of our sectors, focus our work in ways that address the racial wealth and opportunity gap in our region and across Minnesota. And we also know that our approaches to economic recovery need to position us to be better prepared to weather crises, including storms, both figurative and literal, as we face a growing climate crisis. So the question that that really brought up for me, and I think for all of us today, is how do we learn from the tragedies that we faced here over these last 6 months, and find the opportunities to adopt new approaches to growth and development that can make our region stronger, more equitable, and more resilient. So I know that there's a lot of discussion about that happening around us all the time, but I do think we have 4 really amazing speakers with us here this morning that have been thinking a lot about the answer to that question. So I'm really excited to be having a conversation with them and with all of you. So I also just want to note quickly, so during this panel, I would love for folks to just, we're a group of the size that we can also be having our sort of side conversation in chat. So people have questions that are coming up. If you want to put them in chat or have some discussion as we're listening, we encourage you to do that. And then we'll also use the sort of virtual hand raising function at the end to do direct live questions for the speakers after I've asked them just a few questions, and I'll indicate when we're going to move to that piece as well. So I'm just going to start by having each of you say a little something, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order by first name, so that makes it easy. So I think that puts Amanda first. So I'm hoping you can start by introducing yourself and sharing in a few sentences who you are, a few key insights that came from the conversation that we had ahead of time and from listening to your fellow panelists. And just keeping in mind, of course, that not everyone has listened to all of those interviews. So it's a good chance to summarize kind of some of your key points.
Awesome, thanks so much, and hello everybody. It's so great to be here this morning and to participate in this really great conversation. Yeah, this is the conversation. This is what we spend most of our time on at Greater MSP. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Greater MSP is the Regional Economic Development Partnership for the Metro. So that's the 15 county region. We work to accelerate economic competitiveness for the region and inclusive economic growth. We do that by partnering with over 300 organizations across the region, from region level down to local level, to develop strategies to grow this economy. I lead our research and intelligence team, so I do a lot of data analysis to understand all of the dynamics of our regional economy and how that can inform really smart action and strategy. So A lot of fun things to talk about this morning about just how we see the economy changing. Certainly really serious things, but I would echo this theme of we don't, as we think about economic recovery for the region, we all recognize that it's not about getting back to normal, because our normal wasn't really that great for everybody in this region. It's really about transforming the regional economy and reimagining the regional economy and how we want to grow so that everybody has access to the economy. Because the only way we grow is if everyone is participating and has opportunity to participate in the economy. So really excited to dive into the details on that, but we'll leave it there for now. So thanks again for having me.
Thanks. And Andrea, you're next.
Great. I'm Andrea Fursten, Vice President of System Innovations with the Center for Economic Inclusion. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. And the Center for Economic Inclusion really launched 3 years ago with a focus on racial equity and inclusive growth. And I would say around 3 key strategies: fostering shared accountability, dismantling systemic racism and oppression, and cultivating place-based regional opportunity. So as I was reflecting on the conversation we had last week and then really listening to my colleagues, I'd say there were a few things that kind of lifted up for me that I want to share. One is that intersectional relationship between the new climate economy and a more inclusive economy that builds wealth in BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. The health and growth of our economy depends on our ability to facilitate and maximize inclusion. And our overall well-being depends on an economy that directs the talent and innovation to accelerate climate action. So I think it's really those 2 things coming together. Similarly, I think we need to recognize that climate change disruptions in supply chains tied to things like food supply and housing disproportionately impact low-income communities and BIPOC communities. So we need to think with that intention about the solutions. So as we have an opportunity and an imperative really to grow green jobs and businesses, we are required to really have that commitment to racial equity and inclusion, which I so appreciate the focus of this conversation today. And so this is about needing to show up in supplier diversity investments differently, our hiring, development of people and benefits, and then our policies and practices. The reality is that the lack of income parity in our economy between whites and BIPOC is resulting in over $32 billion being left on the table. So that's a pretty startling figure for us to all grapple with. What I would just close with is note that economic development nationwide and here in the metro has a long history of devaluing and extracting wealth from BIPOC individuals and communities. So when we now think about community economic development, and I really appreciate the intention around that, that question last week, it's really a holistic approach to development grounded in inclusion, self-determination, and collective action. We have to ensure that our community is shaping investments, policies, and approaches that are responsive to the needs of our community. So thank you.
Thanks, Bree.
Thank you for including the Blue-Green Alliance in this conversation. So Bree Halverson, I'm the Minnesota Program Manager for the Blue-Green Alliance. And for people who aren't familiar with us, we were started over 10 years ago by the United Steelworkers and the Sierra Club with the tagline that we don't believe that we need to make a choice between good family-sustaining jobs and a clean and healthy environment. And so we have been working since then to try to figure out where that intersection can happen for everyone. So, and we've grown since then to have a very different array of unions to belong to our organization, as well as just some of the larger environmental organizations. And so this conversation feels right in our wheelhouse because we are always trying to figure out how to make sure that as we're thinking about transition into the clean green economy, that we're thinking about how we're also creating family sustaining jobs. And the way that we think about that is making sure that there are benefits and good wages where obviously a family can be supported. So we want to make sure that to get there, more people are at the table to be able to help that happen. So that's just kind of comes out of the union organizing philosophy of bringing a committee together to make sure we get what we need as workers. So, and I think listening to some of my fellow panelists, and especially Mr. Lilligren, I think what struck me is I am excited to see sort of the next generation really step up and be leaders in these movements. So they are part of the new sort of worker movement with people trying to organize for safety and health and good benefits. And they're also part of the movement to move people to a more racial and diverse world. And so I think I'm inspired by their leadership, and I hope we look at what they're doing and try to figure out how to make sure that they're at the table to make sure that we have like a cleaner, greener world. So I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Robert, a little bit, I guess, cursed with a name towards the end of the alphabet. Oh, welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, it was heavily weighted toward the beginning of the alphabet. So, Bujun and Debe Megana Dok, Bawababi Genekagan Dunjaba, Ojoish Koganej in Dodam, Ogemamish Kwadez in Indigenous Kaz. I'm Robert Lilligren. I just introduced myself very formally in Ojibwe, which was my grandmother's first language. I'm a dual citizen, a citizen of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation, a citizen of the United States. I am a third generation Minneapolis urban Indian, although I didn't grow up here. I now live just over the hill from where my grandmother spent her adult life and my father grew up, and I'm here with sort of two hats. One is as the Met Council member for District 7, which is South Central Minneapolis, downtown to the river, North Loop, North Minneapolis, and Robbinsdale, where I chair the Community Development Committee. I'm also the CEO of the Native American Community Development Institute, NACD, which is an asset-based community development intermediary that, among other things, shepherds the community's vision of an American Indian cultural corridor along East Franklin. I'm also bringing a perspective of a recent group I've joined. I was invited into the core strategy group for the city of Minneapolis, Minneapolis Forward, or Minneapolis Forward Community Now Coalition is the full name, which is advising the city on economic investments, post-COVID, post-civil unrest. And the kind of two things I just want to comment on is the idea of community development and the capacity needed in communities to participate in driving their own visions. That's a big part of what I do in my day job at NACD. And the other is in the local, and really centering the local, and whether that's on local production, local energy, but really local decision making and local planning, and really embracing and lifting up local visions, whether that's right here in the core city where I have lived for decades, or it's in the more rural parts of the metro. And I just want to really thank the organizers for having me here today. Miigwech.
Thanks, and I want to again remind everyone there is so much great stuff from all of these folks that you can listen to in the recorded pieces that were sent out ahead of this event. And we'll send it out again afterwards because this piece is going to really focus on kind of engagement and what's the role that everyone's to play in inclusive, sustainable, and resilient redevelopment and development. So the next question I have is, it's clear that there's a role that needs to be played at all different levels of government in terms of how we're approaching this sort of question of economic recovery, as well as the private sector. We'll do that next. But I was hoping you could each speak a little bit to how different jurisdictions, local, state, and federal, and local, of course, has many different jurisdictions too, that you all touch in different ways. But how do they need to work together to make sure that our economy recovers in a way that is more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient?
I can go first, I guess, since I'll just keep going first, huh? Does that work? So I think that makes sense since I cover a regional scale perspective, and I think my colleagues have, I have varying scales here. And so, yeah, I mean, Greater MSP as a regional entity is in a great position because we can engage through our partnership with local partners. That's primarily city partners and county level partners, and really scale solutions at the regional level. So we can really build solutions that have significant impact for the region. And so when we think about the region, you know, this is the way we talk often when we're talking to the company that may be considering moving here, growing here. The region is really the economic area. And so when I say that, it's like, that's where your workforce is. You know, your workforce isn't only going to come from the city that your office is located, or even the county. You really are drawing from the entire region. And so when we talk about why is a region important, it's because it really does represent a lot of really interconnected activities, primarily people across city and county lines all the time. So the work that we do at the regional level is really important, but I do want to point out something really important that we've learned, especially this year, and what as COVID and as the killing of George Floyd has really brought to light, is that there are hyper local solutions that are critical to really advancing and improving our region and really tackling these systemic barriers to our growth and certainly around racial equity and justice. And so this improved linkage between community development, which is really local based, and then economic development is something that I think is now here to stay in a way that we really hadn't seen before. And so that's a great learning for us as an organization and a partnership to be more effective at what we do. I do just also want to acknowledge the role of the state and federal government in what we do. Right now, you know, a lot of federal funding is available for regional recovery and resiliency. And we'll talk about that some more, I think, or you can listen to my conversation around Federal Economic Development Administration funding for local recovery efforts. And so we're doing our best to bring in and provide access for local communities in our region to federal funding that's going to help us recover more quickly and be more resilient for future, certainly not just pandemics, but you know, it's going to make us more resilient as a region.
So I'll just build on that. As Amanda's referring to the federal dollars that we, you know, now are eligible to apply for, that really comes from the work that Greater MSP, the Center for Economic Inclusion, and Met Council really partnered and engaged the community in developing a regional economic framework. And that framework is really focused on advancing racial equity and inclusive growth for our region, positioning us for the level of kind of alignment and accountability, shared accountability that we need. And so that can be found on Met Council, Greater MSP, any of our websites, and is worth looking at. But I think that speaks to, as we think about city, county, metro, state, federal government, all these different, you know, key stakeholders in our community, how do we begin to leverage those planning tools? So thinking about comprehensive plans as they get developed, how are we ensuring that we're aligning with that sort of regional vision and framework, and really driving and leading with racial equity and inclusive growth moving forward. We have to start prioritizing and thinking differently and engaging community in that solution building. And so I think that's part of where we've seen in the case of Ramsey County and developing their economic and inclusion plan, months of engagement with community and helping to inform the solutions that they hope to arrive at in early 2021. That's the type of, I think, work we need and intention we need moving forward. And I think it's also just important to recognize partnership is informed by kind of the key roles that different segments of our government play. So as we think about, and I'm not saying these are the only roles, but cities have housing and business development, counties, services, training, land development, metro area transportation, water, sewage system. I think recognizing sort of each of those roles, federal, one can argue, like there's the recovery investments. So how do we think about each of those levers and leverage points as we move forward?
Robert, I know that you had a lot to say on some of this as well when we talked.
Yeah, I was going to say, Andrea just gave me a really great sort of segue to like how I think about some of this stuff is just sort of like, what are all the levers at each level of government and what is each level of government good at doing? And I always think about the federal government as a great way to just put an influx of money into an area that needs it. And so for a lack of a more sophisticated term, sending some cash down. And I think figuring, and I think what's good like about thinking about a region and why it's important to actually think regionally is then like utilize what I think that the state, the county, and the local government are good at doing, and making sure that money that could come in is utilized the best way. And I personally think that the local government, like the city, is really good at making people feel like they have a decision point about this stuff, right? So because you can just the city can set up a group and like the community and listen to people, and then they can think about how to like utilize that better. And I think that sometimes we don't utilize all of these great levels of government and all of these really dedicated public employees, that's what they do. And I think we should figure out how to use those resources to make people feel included. And we always kind of at local governments have a joke, right, that like no matter what happens, everybody's going to blame the mayor. Well, that's kind of true, right? So like people feel connected to that city, so let's use that connection to reach out further and direct those dollars in the important places. And I think that's the way we think about it around sort of some of this infrastructure work that we do at Blue Green Alliance. I think that's the way that we think about transition as communities are transitioning from former sort of energy technology to new energy technology. And I think that it could be a way that we, become better out of all of this, because people are going to have a space to be heard. So.
Yeah, cool. And so yes to everything that was said by my colleagues on the panel, for sure. And to really lift up the theme, I think it was Amanda that said it in their opening remarks, that this really isn't about recovery. We're not really interested in getting back to where we were before. This is about being transformational, especially with the resources that are sort of shaking out post-COVID, post-civil unrest. And also to lift up Andrea's word, alignment. And I think there needs to be greater alignment between all levels of government. And, I cut my teeth being an activist in the Phillips area, started organizing at my block and just kind of never stopped organizing. And, it was, it always really amazed me in Phillips. We were famous for having people come in and tell us what we needed and tell us where investment should go and generally stomp on the local community. And then as I started to get more involved in the system and kind of interact with levels of government, I understood that the cities were the ones that were responsible for the long range vision, the 100-year vision. And I quickly understood that there was definitely a sense of pay to play. So whoever put the most money into an initiative or a project had the most say. So federal, state, regional, county, and then local. And that dissonance really always kind of bugged me. And that was one of the things that prompted me to run for city council and to serve on city council for 12 years, was trying to get this most local voice to be truly directing a lot of resources that were coming into communities. And I think that's the alignment part we're always working on, and it was a surprise to me as I got involved with government, how each jurisdiction really defends its space and authority and doesn't necessarily naturally want to align with other jurisdictions. Often they're in conflict, and even when the resources are all coming into the same community. And so you know, I think we have a moment here in history to sort of set that jurisdictional division aside and really figure out how to be collaborative and work collaboratively. And I think tools like the Regional Economic Framework are huge steps forward in doing that. And the other thing we need to do is to really believe that local communities know what's best for them. They're the best at articulating their vision. They're the best at setting a plan to realize that vision. And government, we used to say, you know, some jurisdictions go out and listen to the people and then do whatever they want anyway. And I think to really shift that framework, that paradigm, to saying, okay, these local voices, these local communities should be centered, they should be leading our investments and efforts. Thanks.
All right, so the other piece to this, the private sector is a necessary partner in development of all different types. And we have folks who are listening here today and maybe later who represent and work with companies of all different sizes. So what do you think the role of the private sector is in developing a more inclusive and sustainable region? And that includes some of our large companies and employers too. So yeah, how do you see the role of the private sector? And you don't have to go in your alphabetical order stack, but you can if it makes it easier.
I'll not go first, so if somebody else wants to. Andrea, I think you have great things to say about this topic, so I'm going to nominate you.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. So yeah, I'm happy to talk on this. I think the role of the private sector, I appreciate the question because I think it's absolutely critical, along with the public sector, in advancing this inclusive growth and a new climate economy. So I think as we think about growing BIPOC supply chains that accelerate climate action, having deep cultures, policies, and practices that are inclusive, thereby positioning companies for maximum growth and productivity. I think this really is their role to kind of lead and serves as kind of a multiplying effect in our community. So I think back to, you know, Greater MSP's survey years ago, lose track of time, around sort of our ability to retain BIPOC talent. The culture needs to change both within our companies that then will, I think, have that multiplying effect in terms of our community as a whole. And that is going to require a fair amount of intention. So I think as we think about the private sector playing a role in shaping public policy and community development and talent development and retention, what that then looks like. Our racial disparities, the fact is that they reflect our failures across sectors, and the opportunity for inclusive growth really depends on our ability to execute systemic change across sectors. So as we think about that systemic change, the Center for Economic Inclusion is beginning to work with both public and private, but a number of companies in really executing that systemic change, beginning with this specialized assessment that measures across kind of key areas of a company around household financial security, employee engagement, economic growth and inclusion, all within the sense of driving change within these areas of their policies, within their philanthropy if they're a bigger company, within their human resource department, marketing, looking at what needs to change across all those different levers to really create the change in the community that we need as well. And so that's some of the work that we're embarking on with companies, beginning with that customized assessment and then moving into action planning and then a set of services to help drive that change over time. We know this isn't overnight solutions. But we've seen companies more and more in the headlines in our newspapers talking about sort of restructuring their staffing, more intention in their supplier diversity and their investments in the BIPOC supply chain and BIPOC small business development. We've seen companies begin to look at hiring targets of 20% of new hires will be BIPOC. And so I think that's the kind of levers that we're looking at and the kind of measures and accountability that we need our private sector folks to lead on.
Thanks. And I want to make sure we have some time for questions too. So I don't know if even just one more of you wanted to speak a little bit to that, and then we can open it up a little bit for some more discussion.
I'll just say real quick, I think that Andrea's points all about like different levers and thinking through the different policies about how, you know, that there is growth and looking at supply chains. At Blue Green Alliance, we also are looking at what levers we think will be helpful. We have a policy tool, we have different policy toolkits on our website, and also, you know, making sure that there's local hire. We know that that is a helpful policy. Also, real quick, we also know that like making sure that we're thinking about wages and how wages and benefits are also sort of important mix to making sure that there's just sort of better parity. And so there's a bunch of good stuff on our website. You can go there.
Great. So I don't know if there are maybe questions that anyone else wants to pose to our panelists. You can do one of two things, and you know, and I know there's been some conversation happening in the chat, and then also you can use the raise hand feature if you just wanted to ask a question directly, and you should be able to find that. If you go to your participants link at the bottom, then you should be able to raise hand, and we can keep an eye out for that as well. And, you know, as people think about that, I was hoping to maybe to dig in a little bit more around this question of sort of economic development versus community development and ways that those two terms get used. And I thought it was one of the really interesting things that I observed just talking to the four of you a little bit more extensively ahead of time, the way that I think this, that the pandemic and everything that's happening around us has sort of brought what were sometimes two very different fields into closer conversation. And Amanda, you had said, you know, they're not going to go back to being separate in the ways that they were, but I wanted to just sort of invite any of you to speak a little bit more to kind of that relationship, and I guess what it takes from all of us that are, you know, not necessarily participating as directly in the policy and planning around those things, to think about how to bring those concepts into closer alignment.
You know, I'll jump in here real quick, and that's and just I mentioned it earlier too, sort of the capacity for communities to engage. And so, like I said, I was a screamy Phillips activist for years, and just found my way to these tables where planning and decisions for my community were being made. As a matter of fact, Bruce Jacobson, I think, is on this call. He was part of the first sort of planning initiative as we were putting together the 29th Street and Midtown Greenway corridor planning framework or something. And that was my introduction to sort of community planning. And I would sit at these tables where corporations in the community or governmental agencies like MnDOT were planning these significant investments and not really hearing the community, but inviting enough of us to the table to sort of check that community box. And I would raise this point a lot. You know, we need capacity here. We need capacity to engage in planning. And so I think to understand that, and that's why my day job at NACD is just so perfect for me, because it is the people side of community development. It's building that capacity, really engaging with the community. The first thing NACD did was went out and organized around the idea of asset-based community and development, which in the Native community was a fairly new idea. Most of our organizational infrastructure, especially in the urban areas, is around service delivery, because we have a community that has a lot of needs. But the asset-based side wasn't even being addressed. And so educating people about the incredible assets that we have, that every community brings incredible assets into development and into visioning and into planning. And so how do we get very deliberate and very surgical about engaging communities? And if there isn't capacity in there, then investing in the community-based capacity, not the capacity an outsider might think is needed, but invest in building that the infrastructure so that communities can fully engage in their own development.
And speaking of Bruce Jacobson, he is someone who has raised his hand. So Bruce, do you want to ask a question directly? Maybe it builds nicely on that one.
I do. This topic is so important. And I'm an internal optimist, but I may sound cynical in my question here, because many of us, a lot of you guys, I see a lot of young people here, but for those of us with gray hair, we've been at this for many, many decades, similar kinds of conversations. It's much more intense now, obviously, given what's happened in 2020 and so on. My question is, for all of the effort that we've put to this and understanding what the equity issues are and so forth, the mantra that's coming out of our work is partners, not just participants. But we're not seeing that even if we're getting alignments and even if we're getting public sector and private trying to work together and everything, development's never been about equity. Capitalism is not about equity. So how do we, all of our efforts, I don't know that we've moved the needle very much. We still see the data as being increasing gaps, still huge issues related to housing and education and jobs creation and much else. So I'm not slamming any organization or anybody's efforts, but for everything that we've been doing, why aren't we seeing some results in all of this conversation? And what are we talking about today in your individual organizations that's going to bring results to this issue? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I can jump in on that one. I agree. This is a monumental challenge. And for anyone who tracks economic cycles and what happens when we go into downturns and recessions is that those racial employment and wage gaps, they widen because the demand for talent and the demand for workers typically goes down, and employers don't have that same type of pressure to increase wages. And so we know that we have a real uphill battle here, and it's going to take a lot of intention. So my sense from the regional scale and really tackling and talking about these topics from a public and private sector perspective, that alignment, is that there is a new kind of urgency in the private sector around this topic that we haven't seen before. And, you know, I think that we have a pretty optimistic and hopeful perspective on their pledges. I'll give one example. There's a good real gathering of procurement leads for our major corporates in the region who already have pledges or goals to meet supplier spend targets in the state. So have really localized, regionalized, building stronger supply chain linkages in the region. And what they're doing now is saying, okay, let's go one step further. Let's set targets to spend with minority-owned businesses in the region. Like, let's make some real true intentions around increasing that corporate spend with diverse suppliers. And that has enormous economic impact on the region. I think they're really putting some hard lines in paper to say that we're going to do this and this is important. So I as a data person, I know what we face here. I know that this is going to be incredibly challenging, especially as we go through recovery, just getting jobs back. If anyone is following future of work and what's going on in how jobs are changing and displacements due to automation, we have severe barriers to getting jobs back because so many of them are just not going to come back. They are being replaced through automation. And so we have a lot of work to do around workforce development to make sure people have jobs that are resilient jobs that are going to stick around. So multifaceted, incredibly complex and challenging, but real intention around focusing on this and doing it right. So that's all I would add on that one.
I feel like that was a really great question. So I'm hoping maybe others want to chime in for a second to add to what Amanda said.
I would just chime in. I appreciate the question, and I think you know, Bruce, what you're alluding to is our systems, are working as they were designed to work, and that's the reality is that's in a racist way, and so it requires a different anti-racist lens as we now relook at those systems. And so I think the work at the greater MSP that those companies are now doing to think about those targets and those investments in BIPOC businesses is critical as part of that supply chain. But then we also need to think about what does it look like for those businesses to be ready for those contracts. And so what's that part of the solution need to then look like? Similarly, as we think about capital, how are we ensuring that we're partnering with the finance sector in terms of rethinking how they provide that capital for BIPOC businesses? What needs to change there in terms of those policies and practices? So I think those are the kinds of both conversations and then actions that we need to see with that level of intention. And I think housing is filled with, both challenges, but also opportunities to rethink sort of zoning and housing density and solutions there that, that of course are intricately tied to environment as well. And so how do we think about that intersectionality? So I'll stop there, but just want to call out that I think that's the right question. And time will tell as to whether we go far enough.
Great. Does anyone, Bree or Robert, did you want to say anything about sort of how do we know that things are changing? How do we know that we're actually doing something different that can produce a different result?
So one thing is data, right? And so I got elected to city council in 2001, and that's when we were first seeing enough data that showed these disparities not only persisted, they were constantly growing. And I think that surprised a lot of us here because we kind of felt like we were the, a progressive center. And so data helps a lot, but I just really want to uplift what Andrea said, and the system is working like it was designed to. This is the result of deeply rooted racism in our culture, in our institutions, in the way we behave. That informs everything that we do. And I think what is different now, and what I'm hoping is different, and this persists and is sustained, is that not just the pandemic, that was showing the gaps growing at super alarming rates, and sort of, at least in my experience in government, we were kind of responding as government responds to things like that, which is, kind of slowly. And I think it's the murder of George Floyd that has really changed things. And now we can no longer pretend that it isn't racism that is contributing to these disparities. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like in a lot of the answers to these questions, it's about leadership, right? Both public sector and private sector. And the leadership really needs to embrace the kinds of initiatives that Amanda's talking about, and in the public sector as well. And then see that leadership then pervades the entire organization, again, whether it's private sector or not. But I think it's this moment that we're in. And I recently heard someone describe this as, the potential of the Minneapolis magic, right? And I feel like that's an asset-based way of framing a really horrific event that has made Minneapolis famous. And this is what we'll be known for a very long time. And so I think really embracing this moment and having those difficult conversations and having real strong expressions of leadership at all levels of an organization, we will have the data that shows that we are actually making progress and not continuing to move in the wrong way.
Thanks. All right, go ahead, Bree.
Oh, I didn't know if we were moving on. But I would just say real quick.
Go ahead, no, please do. Yeah.
I just say real quick, like, I definitely agree and want to also lift up what Andrea said about the systems, and that is true. And also, like, I think for someone that comes from the labor movement, I am inspired by all the organizing and inspired by, you know, what people are organizing around and how they're doing it and who's in that mix. And I think I will know that things will change when what they're organizing around is something they don't need to organize around anymore. And there are people in the streets organizing around something else. And so that's just the way I look at it. And it means that we're moving forward. And so, so all of that organizing may feel, and people in the streets may feel sort of like, I don't know, like like this time is challenging and may feel about it. For me, it's inspiring because it means that like people are drawing attention to something. It means that like hopefully somebody will put something in place that will then change those systems, and then we can then move on to the next fight.
So this is our time to move into breakout groups. And actually Lily was sending messages to say like, send people off the question. And I also noticed that Nick has his hand up. So what I'm gonna do is, Nick, have you asked your question, but I think we'll probably like go off and maybe we can all discuss what, you know, a response to what you're thinking about, if that maybe works for you, Nick.
Sure. I mean, I think my question is in a way just maybe a more specific version of what we've just been talking about. But I'm thinking about the post-uprising rebuilding efforts, Lake Street and Midway, and these things that where there's really been a focus of attention, right, and kind of an outpouring of like individual donations and private sector donations and stuff. And there's a lot of desire to do things differently, right? To not just restore what was there, but actually make it more just and more, sustainable in both an environmental and an economic sense, and so on. But I was going to ask the speakers if they want to reflect on, and we can do this after or whatever. What gives cause for hope that will actually happen? That people won't just kind of forget, and then at best we end up with just kind of rebuilding what's there, or at worst we end up with kind of gentrification and actually pushing people out, making things worse, because there's now a space to like create something new, but there's also a space to like for folks to come in and sweep up the opportunities and so on. So like I don't know how optimistic people who I'm sure all of you are very directly engaged in some of these efforts, how optimistic you are of the sustained attention and sustained determination to actually do that rebuilding in a way that is more transformative in a racial equity, economic equity sense. So anyway, I think it's what we've already been talking about, but I just those neighborhoods give kind of a geographic focus to it as well.
Great. I think that would be a terrific question to sort of send us all out to those conversations with. And Lila's going to talk a little bit more about how the breakout groups will work.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, thank you all so much for your participation and your questions. I would also love for us to I realize that we just went into screen share, but like some sparkle fingers or some clapping or shout outs in the chat to show appreciation to our speakers. Thank you all so much for both participating this morning and also taking some time before this to record interviews with us. And so those conversations are awesome. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to them, I would highly encourage that. But yeah, so our hope is to talk probably until about between 20 and 25 after in your groups to continue relationship building and application of the concepts. I also know some of our speakers may drop off at 10 or may continue on. You're welcome to do either. But yeah, thanks again, and we'll send us off into our breakout groups when Malia has that figured out. Great, thanks everybody. Welcome back, everyone. I know breakout groups are never enough time, and today might feel like in line with that. As folks come back, I would love for you to share a question or a highlight or a takeaway in the chat from your discussion. I know we're particularly interested in following this call to be able to compile some resources to respond to the questions that all of you still have, to bring back to your teams for further reading, for other discussion. And so those questions really help us be able to curate what we might send along. So I'll leave a couple minutes, or if y'all can drop that into the chat now, that would be great. And if anyone feels like they want to share that out loud, you're welcome to as well. We have a couple of minutes before I'll do my closing comments. So yeah, go ahead, Bill. Poppert.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we talked about and that I specifically wanted to bring to the table is reaffirming a role that I think Environmental Initiative has had in the 25 years that I've known the organization, is bringing people and bringing organizations that are diverse on many levels together over issues. And I think these issues have been issues for a very long time. The economy, justice, the environment, clean energy. I mean, they are the issues of 2020. They were the issues of 20 years ago. And it is not often that the small business, the large business, the NGO, the government entity get to sit together and discuss these things. And I think going forward, we will be better informed if we go forward working together than if we go forward alone. So I guess my word, my comment, my question is, I think this is a valuable exercise in consensus building and information sharing. And I commend EI for doing what they've done with this.
Thank you for your comments. Would another person like to share a takeaway or a question that you still have? All right, my colleagues know that I can definitely hold a silence, but I will not hold you in silence for too long. Great, well, thank you. We really appreciate your participation in today's event. And to kind of close out today, there are a couple opportunities to stay engaged with us. So first, I want to thank all of our speakers and all of you for helping make this event what it was, and also thank our presenting series sponsors, Dorsey and Whitney and Wink, one more time. I'd also like to give a big shout out to the EI Policy Forum team that made today possible. Leah Hausnecht, Christina Vang, and Rachel Geisinger, as well as our advancement officer, Sasha Seymour Anderson, who is not on the call today. Kind of what to look out for, a couple of things. First, if you were hoping to meet someone and were not able to connect with them, but you saw their name on the call, please feel free to email me and I can make sure to make that introduction for you. I know that one of the things about our policy forums is that they are great networking opportunities, and we want to make sure that you're able to still connect with folks in the ways that you'd like. Kind of bridging into that, we'll be sending out an evaluation in the coming weeks about this new format, about the content, what would you like more of, less of. We want to keep making these policy forums, we're kind of learning as we go in this new format, and so we want to keep making them better as the season or the series progresses. And then finally, in our summary audio content, we would love to hear from at least a handful of you about your reflections about your key takeaways, calls to action, questions that you have that we can include in a follow-up audio piece. And there's information about what we're looking for on the screen, as well as Rachel just dropped it into the chat. But we'd love for you to record yourself answering the question, what are your key takeaways on how to build a more just and resilient economy in the Twin Cities region. Try to keep your clip under 2 minutes and email it to Christina by the end of day next Tuesday, and we'll be releasing it after that. So yeah, without further ado, that's our event for today. We appreciate all of you participating, and you get 4 minutes back of your life. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you. Our next policy forum will be on the 14th of October about building more resilient food systems. And so there'll be information about how to register for that in our follow-up email. Cool, thanks everybody.
Thank you, have a good day.